warm welcome from my side. Wishing you all a good afternoon or good morning. We picked this time of the day to allow for colleagues from North America maybe to join in other areas of the globe, because obviously this is an interesting topic, radicalization hubs. Briefly gonna introduce the speakers, our experts. First of all, that's Paul Mentz. Paul is a PCVE practitioner working in a CSO called U-Turn in Dortmund, Germany. And fortunately and unfortunately, he has a lot of experience dealing with right-wing extremists as a practitioner in Dortmund. Paul is speaking here in his private capacity, so he's not representing the CSO, but he's here as an expert. The second speaker is Mikkel Hjelt. He just finished his PhD on Islamist hotbeds in Denmark, and he is an independent advisor to the city of Aarhus. And then we have Professor Noemie Bouhana, who is French, but lives and works in the UK and is an associate professor in security and crime science at the University College London, and she's very interested in the where do things happen, and that's why we thought this is a perfect fit to today's topic. I'm now going to switch and start my presentation in a second by briefly telling you what we are looking into and what we have looked into, because as you imagine, the topic is rather broad and can be looked at from different perspectives. So what we did is at this meeting, the basic assumption, the lead assumption for this meeting was that while violent extremism obviously is a global phenomenon, extremists usually start their radicalization process in their local context. Radicalization to violent extremism in particular, however, is not happening everywhere. So, and even if we look at cities or neighborhoods or communities that are comparable in regards to political, social, socioeconomic circumstances or grievances, they are often very different radicalization-related developments. In other words, some neighborhoods struggle with a significant higher number of radicalized individuals than others, making them so-called hotbeds or hubs of radicalization. So we wanted to know and look into why do some neighborhoods turn into those hotbeds or hubs, while others facing comparable challenges or factors do not. And we had a couple of lead questions, key questions that we wanted to discuss. The factors as discussed, socioeconomic, cultural, social, political, which ones seem to be contributing to the emergence of hotbeds of radicalization, which preventive or repressive strategies or actions have led to positive or negative results and why. How can stigmatization of neighborhoods and communities affected by hotbeds be prevented? How can the resilience of affected neighborhoods and communities be strengthened? How can we involve the affected neighborhoods or communities more effectively in the PCVE efforts? And what is the online dimension of this phenomenon? So these were some of the main questions we were looking at. We're not going to go through these questions here piece by piece, but this is a bit the overarching framework. But of course, we will include your questions in the Q&A session.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm coming from a certain angle dealing with this problem. Some of you may or may not know that Dortmund is quite well-known hub for radicalization or right-wing extremism, if you want to call it that way. And even the New York Times wrote about our city. The angle I'm coming from is we basically have a hub here, and I'm going to try to show you ways to avoid becoming a hub, or at least deal with it if you're in the similar situation that we are in. Through our work, we have quite a bit of experience dealing with right-wing extremism, so that may help. Just to kind of give you a brief mind map, what we're dealing with and which problems will probably come together if you're going to become a hotbed. The first one is important. I'll get to all these points later a little bit, but if you don't have any room for expansion, if there's no property, no places that right-wing extremist entrepreneurs can use, you're probably not going to have a hotspot. You're not going to become a hotbed or a hub. It will simply not emerge. You might have to deal with a right-wing extremist scene, but it won't grow to the level we are dealing with. The other thing that's pretty obvious is if you're indifferent to this problem and you have certain things in place that at least make it possible or that you could become a right-wing hotbed, hub, then indifference is obviously the big no. No matter what we do, doing nothing is probably the worst case scenario. We can do bad things by doing things, but ignoring a problem will not make it go away. The third point I want to speak about is ideology. It's important, not in a sense, what is the ideology? We obviously have to deal with that, but I won't be able to go into that extensively due to the brief time I have today. But it's important to know, who do we speak to, who do we speak with, who are our allies and who are part of the problem within a community, within the municipality we're dealing with. We have to find out who are potential recruits. That's really important if we're talking about social work and interventions. Who do we want to try to reach out to? Who are kind of the people we want to work with, in a sense that as social workers try to connect with a certain group of people and prevent them from becoming radicalized. And probably the most important thing, once you notice that this is taking place, you probably will have to deal with a hub if other things are in place already. That's if you have a catalyst, if you have people that are well organized, that are, if you want to call them that, entrepreneurs of radicalization. If you have people that as catalysts can kind of recruit people, can get people to follow them, then you're probably going to have a problem within your city. So we have to know, who do we want to get rid of, or who do we want to limit in the way they can interact with people within the community and they can express themselves. This is really important. In Dortmund at the moment, we're seeing one of the most important leaders of the neo-Nazi scene is leaving Dortmund due to losing basically the ability to act as they will. Their possibilities of agitating have been limited, and therefore this person is moving to Eastern Germany, and that will be a huge game changer for us. Why is ideology important? Ideology has to be present in some way, in some frame, in the socialization or in individual and collective experiences within communities. The problem that we have here is we have to find out who is part of the problem and who is part of the solution. That's really important when we're interacting with communities. We have to find out who shares certain values with extremist groups, even if they may not agree with the means these groups are willing to go to achieve their goals. These people may seem harmless at first, but they are part of the groups that are basically keeping this ideology we're dealing with within these communities, and always create a kind of atmosphere, create the ideological background that makes it possible that we have to deal with the same problem in the future. So we have to find out who are our allies, who shares values with these extremists, even if they don't share the means, and who doesn't share these values, who shares values that are more in the sense of a multicultural or a democratic society. The second problem we have is we will always have people who share the values of extremists within the community, even on an individual level. That may not be that important at first, but it's really important for us within these communities to frame the values we as a city, as a municipality, as a country, as a democracy stand for, and basically frame these values as positive values that exclude extremist values. So we won't be able to convince every individual within these municipalities and communities, but we have to make pretty clear that we do not share these values, and there are good reasons why we do not share values that extremists share. And the third problem is one that we will not be able to solve at the level we're talking about at the moment. That's usually a crisis within a society, in situations where certain economic crisis or other situations that people deal with become overwhelming. We obviously have a higher risk that people will join these movements. When we're talking about potential recruits, what can we do to reach out to potential recruits, to create an environment, to create a community that doesn't leave young people vulnerable to radicalization? The first thing that we found really important and that was neglected very long in Dortmund is we need to offer supporting networks or support networks at schools. We need to communicate and work with endangered youth before they become radicalized. So there has to be a presence at schools, in communities, in municipalities that are dealing with radicalization and that have radical catalysts within the frame of their city walls. Within this work with young people at schools, we obviously have to be able to frame democratic values within the school and kind of reach out to young people, work with young people, try to get them to believe in certain values we all share, and at the same time work with them, talk with them, communicate with them about the crisis they're facing, the fear of what their futures may look like, and actually also deal with the interactions they have with radical groups. The other problem we see in these cities is daycare. It may seem weird to talk about very young children, but if we have a hub of radicalization, if we have a hotbed, we have right-wing extremist parents, or extremist parents, basically no matter what their views are, no matter what kind of a hotbed we have. And these parents will probably teach their children certain values. And they will also strike the fear of God, if I may say so, into the other parents within that have children in these daycare facilities and the people working there. So we have to find a way to support educators in daycare to deal with right-wing or with extremist parents and with children that grow up in this framework, and try to find a way to at least teach these children at a very young level a certain way that they are able to deal with, tolerate a certain level of ambiguity, and deal with things that not everything is black and white, but you can do one thing and a different thing at the same time, and both can be okay. And we have to support parents within these communities that have children who are in danger of becoming radicalized or are radicalized already. It's really important to teach parents that they have to be firm in their values and the rules they lay down towards their children, but at the same time, they are very, very important people to stay in touch and show that there is a certain affectionate bond between them and their children, that they are people that are there and their children want to change, or if their children are looking for support. Nothing is worse than people becoming isolated in these kind of religious cult-like extremist groups and having no contact to parents who basically give up on them, or having parents that are not able, don't feel they are able to kind of stand for certain values that are opposed to what their children are doing. And we have to offer young people within these in these communities options, what they can do with their life, that things they can experience in a positive way, that basically are similar to what the right-wing extremists or extremist groups offer, but in a more positive and a more inclusive way. So we have to have something that is just as attractive as what right-wing groups offer. And best case scenario, we get highly respected actors involved in our campaigns and our work with young people, people that young people look up to. That can be musicians, it could be football players, football clubs, whatever, people that kind of give a certain strength to the view we are trying to share within these communities. When dealing with a catalyst, it's a totally different situation. We have to find a way to isolate them. These people are great organizers. They're extremist leaders. We are not going to be able to interact with them in any way that will change their view of things. So basically, we have to isolate them within the community. We have to empower community leaders and networks that disagree with the fundamentals of the extremist ideology that these people are spreading, and not just the methods and means. So we have to either find these networks or build up networks within communities that have strong views that challenge the views and values of extremist groups, We have to occupy public space as good as it is possible and use it for positive activities. Extremist leaders are very good at finding public spaces and using them for their propaganda. And this is where police becomes really important. We need a zero tolerance policy towards them. We have to make clear who are the victims of this ideology and these activities. And we have to avoid falling into the victimhood trap they will set and say everybody's against us. This is not freedom of speech. We have to make clear who the real victims are and who are not real victims, and in this case, the extremist leaders. Infrastructure, I'll be really brief because I'm probably running out of time already. It's just important to make sure we remove as much real estate as possible that extremists can use. We have to find out who would be willing participants in renting out real estate to right-wing extremists or in any way cooperating with them. That can be opportunistic or economically motivated. It's important to show these people that their actions have consequences within the community and the city, that it might lead to loss of social status, financial consequences, and in some cases, repression by police. Basically, we have to keep extremists as far away from schools as possible. And we have to find spaces that they cannot use to extend their social control over recruits and potential members of the groups. So we have to try to keep them from public spaces as good as we can and keep these open for everyone. And the last point I want to make is it's really important that we are not indifferent towards the people in these neighborhoods. People are often, it's usually neighborhoods that are not very well off economically. There's a lot of anger and frustration in these communities, usually aimed at city, state officials, and institutions, and we have to build up a certain level of trust. People will tell you we have other problems, and therefore it's important, if we identify this problem early enough, we should start out not by just addressing right-wing extremism or extremism at all, but basically try to solve other problems in these communities at the same time before we address right-wing extremism or extremism, and try to communicate to the people that we know they have problems and this is not the only problem, and we see the situation as a whole situation. We want to help the community. The other thing is we have to be careful that we don't kind of give the impression that we're only dealing with these communities and supporting them because of extremists within the community. If we do that, there's two ways. Either they shut down and say, we don't want to work with you because you don't care about us if we don't have extremists, or they'll say it's not that bad to have extremists because when there are extremists within our community, people care about us. If there are no extremists within our community, they don't. We have to find groups that share our values. As I said, that's really important, and not groups that share values with extremist groups. They can, in my opinion, be no part of the communication process. Individuals may be a part of a communication process, individuals with problematic views, but not groups and organizations, even if they don't share the means. They are not going to be the people that are going to really help us. They may be able to kind of put a lid on violence, violent action, and that kind of stuff, but they're not going to change the overall outlook. And the last thing that's really important, I think we have to strengthen allies. We can't discredit them by talking with people that are actually, I'll say it that strong. I think it's important to make it clear that are actually enemies of our allies, people that don't share the values of our democratic allies within these communities. And we have to support positive forces within the community and involve them in the process and make them part of the process. We're not going to be able to change communities wholly from outside. We have to find out who are the people who share our values. And this is just, I know it's really brief, and I've been kind of just running through this as fast as I can, but I think these are important things we have to all keep in mind when dealing with hubs of radicalization. I think that's the only chance we have. And the earlier we react, the better our chances. And worst case scenario is always if you have a group of well-organized leaders, and once that takes part, it becomes a whole new ball game. And well, thank you for having me, and I hope it was at least to a certain level of interest to everyone.
I'm going to present one part of my presentation, a part that taps into the neglected question, why there, in studying radicalization. So let's get started with a tight schedule. So it's it's no new news that we see an uneven geographical distribution of radicalization throughout different European cities within different kind of neighborhoods, and Aarhus is no exception as well. Let's zoom in on Aarhus, which was my case area for my PhD. So just to contextualize Denmark and Aarhus, so on the left side we see Denmark, you can see Aarhus right here, and on the right side we see a more closer look at Aarhus with the northern and western and southern and city center parts like this, and we will look even more closely at Aarhus. Comments about the method. So I draw on selected parts of the Danish community surveys conducted by Mads Lindekilde and Kim Mannemar in Sønderskov. And these community surveys were fielded in 3 disadvantaged neighborhoods in Western Aarhus. One hand comparing 2 neighborhoods marked by significant radicalization against one neighborhood that is comparable in terms of vulnerability, proximity, and size, but with fewer radicalization problems. And then I add with my quantitative interview data within a more similar neighborhood in Western Aarhus, and again to address this aware of radicalization in Aarhus. And it's basically about to collect data about how certain residents are neighbors. So if you look at the findings, so why this uneven concentration in Aarhus, or what is the problem, we can also frame it in this way. We do not find one decisive factor that can explain radicalization differences between neighborhoods. However, there seems to be some neighborhood characteristics that may contribute to the emergence of the radical milieu in a particular neighborhood in Western Aarhus, such as social cohesion, informal social control, and moral context. And I'll just briefly provide elaborate on an example. So if you look at the first one, social cohesion, it's divided, you can say, because on the one hand, we have some communities that are they are very friendly to each other, they know each other, they do things together, they socialize. So on that note, they are very social bonding. But the downside, on the other hand, they are very inward looking. So they really want to solve problems themselves. They only knew themselves, they don't have networks outside some of these neighborhoods. And so you can see, the coin is divided. And if you look at the moral context, the last one, you can see, for example, there was a mutual agreement, you could say, about that gangs activities, shootings like that, and selling drugs were a bad thing, and they got together and supported the police. But when it was about radicalization and specific religious orientated radicalization, they didn't have the same support within, and say, well, this is not about us, or religion is good, and such things. So it was again divided. We can talk more about it in the Q&A. And just some caution. So it's the first investigation of its kind in Denmark, these type of data, and we need more research, and we also need more data to get some more research on this topic. So what can be done to address these immediate challenges or problems in an effective way? I'll just provide some examples. So I think, and it's also context dependent in terms of I'm looking at Denmark, I'm looking at Aarhus. So I think, from my perspective, there is a need to tackle the fear of engaging in specific dialogues. It is time that we talk in a respectful manner, in a good way, about religious perspectives and actions / non-actions. And I want to stress, it's not about bashing religion as such and say that religious people are stupid. It's not about that. But I can see from my data, there is a need to speak about religion both from a human perspective, but also from an academic perspective. There is also in the second bullet is what I call trade-off cooperation. So I think there is we have authorities, organizations on the one hand, and communities and neighborhoods on the other. On the other side, we need to give and take in terms of if we want to use these neighborhoods for data or dialogue or whatever, we also need to listen. Okay, what do you want in your life? What is important for you to proceed or strive in your life? So these trade-off operations, I think, is interesting. Community policing in terms of being visible, being present, that could help, gaining the trust, which I also could see was low. Again, how you communicate and so on. And I think the next one, team up with individuals with commitment. The true commitment and authority openly oppose radical milieux within affected the neighborhoods. I think it's very interesting because they can kind of be to level again. Now, so I was saying that I think that we have these individuals with true commitment and authority. I think they can be very used as perceived as building bridges between these neighborhoods and authorities, organizations, and so forth. And again, city development, I think sometimes physical and social changes, I think that are some interesting perspectives in that. They're doing it very much in some particular neighborhoods in Aarhus. Also focusing on networks outside these neighborhoods, for example, with jobs and so on. And again, when you try to set up these things, I think the keyword actors, I think, is interesting in terms of who should it be and how many and how should be organizing. Okay, thank you for listening. I hope you got a little bit out of it, and I hope that the noise and the echoes were not too disturbing. But that was all for me for this presentation.
So, as Alexander said, this is more of a researcher's perspective. I won't pretend to have the kind of experience that Mikkel and Paul have. We have in mind, who might be a susceptible individual. I'm not going into the details now because, this is not the topic of today, but let's say someone with identity issues, with grievances, with possibly some cognitive and psychological issues and so on. And those you might call the Canaries, right? They're not the only ones who may radicalize, but they may be the first one to drop if they're exposed to gas in the mine. I'm hoping you're familiar with this idea of using Canaries back in the day when there were miners to tell you that toxic gas is raising in the mine. And so the point of this analogy is to say that there are millions of people with these characteristics at any given time, but only a very small proportion is going to radicalize. And what this tells you is that what matters is not being a canary. What matters is ending up in the wrong mine, the one that has the gas rising up. So in this analogy, this is the kind of hubs that we've been talking about up to this point. So it tells you that what matters is the exposure. If there's no exposure, there's no problem. Therefore, exposure is the source of the risk. So that takes you to the second level of possible intervention, and it gets you thinking about what we call selection processes. Why do people end up in those places that, for example, Paul was talking about, this public or private spaces where the radicalizing activity is going on? How does the exposure happen? Because if we understand this, that means possibly we could disrupt it. And so if it's in terms of social selection, well, it might be that, you know, and the activity happens in a particular neighborhood where those people were born, and so they, in a way, cannot escape the attraction of the risky places. But on top of that, there is self-selection, because let's say the actual place where this activity is going on is also a place where they are attracted by their own interests, like a football club. We'll often hear a link between radicalization and sporting activity. It's not that sport causes radicalization, it's that one of those entrepreneurs that Paul was talking about is using the sporting environment as a center of activity. And so if we can understand what are the processes that take people to these places, those are possibly things that we can reroute and disrupt. So that's one level of intervention. So all this to say that what this means is that having intelligence about where the radicalizing activity is taking place is having intelligence about who in this particular neighborhood, for example, is vulnerable out of all the potential Canaries, as we were talking about before. And that's because places choose people for exposure as much as people choose the places where they spend time. So that gets us to think about the third level, which is the actual settings where the extremist activity is taking place. And that is why mapping radicalization physically is so crucial. And when I say this, is that you need to go as micro as the data will allow you to get. So, you know, saying it's this neighborhood is not good enough, saying it's that street is not good enough. In my experience, you have to go down to the building. In fact, you have to go down to the room in the building where the activity is taking place if you really want to start to intervention. And that's where Paul's comments about real estate are so crucial. We need to know exactly where things are going on. Often at this point, someone will tell me, but what about the virtual settings, the online settings? That's not, you know, a building room. But in a way it is, and I regret that Mikkel didn't have the time about his qualitative research, because to me that was the most interesting thing that came out of this work that he did for my project, which was to show how young people accessed online material, but in a physical social environment. They did it, you know, at a diner around a table all together, looking at the phone together, and it was that social setting that led to the sort of radicalizing power of the material, not just looking at a phone per se. It was the discussion that these people were having together. And I think this matters because someone was asking earlier about online interventions. And that means if we want our online interventions to work, we need to think about the setting in which the conditions in which the material that we put online will be accessed, otherwise it will just be inert material. So when you think about what makes a radicalizing setting, it's a setting where you can, you know, be exposed to the ideology. It's a setting where you have the opportunity to form close bonds with those entrepreneurs or people who are already radicalized, as Paul was talking about. And it's a setting where formal and social control is failing. This activity is taking place and yet no one is intervening for a myriad of reasons. There's many reasons why this might be the case. But that's the kind of analysis we need to do. We need to understand, because the fact that the control is failing doesn't just explain how the setting managed to emerge. It explains why it continues to be there. It's not disappearing. And sometimes we succeed in intervening and then we have displacement. Someone mentioned displacement earlier, and that's something we need to keep in mind. You know, how do we prevent the activity from displacing elsewhere? So the fourth, second to last level is the extremist social ecology. It's, if you like, let's call it the community level for short. You know, why are similar neighborhoods, one has a problem, one doesn't, ecology, and the other one doesn't. So this work that I have done, we've looked at, you know, we've mapped actual radicalization in the UK and the US, especially in London, because that's where the best data was. And we see that radicalization concentrated hotspots like any other problem, like many other crimes. And it associates where the hotspots are associates with higher levels of unemployment, higher density of population, and so on and so forth. Many very well-known markers that are usually associated with disadvantage and crime. And that also echoes back some of the things that Paul said. Those are more than one problem, right? Radicalization is only one problem and probably nowhere in the top 10 for the people who live in those places. So that's definitely something to keep in mind when, and when we've done a survey with respondents that basically we've used as CCTV camera to assess the characteristics of their neighborhoods in one borough that had a radicalization problem and another one that we found similarly very well-known of other kinds of disorders and crime that were associated with the emergence of radicalizing settings, like a more transient population, a lower level of informal control. By this I mean, less likely to pick up the phone and call the police if they were witnessing a crime, less trust between neighbors, and so on. So this suggests to me that non-CVE intervention are likely to have an impact as well. And so you can easily think beyond intervening directly with the violent radical milieu or the violent radicals themselves, who I completely agree with Paul, are people that it's very unlikely you're going to change them with your interventions. And so it's better to tackle the moral context of the broader neighborhood. By this, I mean, the people's perceptions of the legitimacy of the government, for example, or the local authorities, their general willingness to break the rules or not break the rules, as the case may be. All of those are ecological drivers that you can intervene with. You don't even have, as I said before, to make it about CVE, which also means that there may be less resistance. But it's a lot of the work that I do is very sort of in the mood right now, because I work with public health models, with epidemiological models of disease contagion. And so this is kind of the hygiene approach. You sort of sanitize the environment, make it just a nicer place to live, and not make it about CVE, and you end up tackling a whole bunch of problems like that. And then the last level is the one that sort of influences further out the emergence of those communities I was talking about, the extremist moral ecologies that eventually, in the end up letting the radicalizing settings emerge. And you can think of it as trickle-down radicalization. And this is arguably the hardest level for you and I to intervene. This is like, the top of the pyramid, if you like. But as we've seen in the US, the diffusion of extremist norms from the top, the governance that is tolerant of extremist acts, discourses that stoke segregation and competition between groups, and that play on perceptions of strains and grievances of certain groups, will fertilize talking about, and make it very, very hard on the ground to sort of fight the fires when you have this sort of thing happening at the top. So you see those 5 levels of interventions, and that each of them you can think about what you could do to disrupt them. And the good news is, because the planets have to align, you only have to disrupt one of them to disrupt the whole thing. But I want to attract your attention, given the topic of today, that 4 of those levels are really about where more than who and why. Thank you for your attention.
I will now share with you some of the findings of that expert meeting that Noemie and Paul and Mikkel and I and others have attended. So you can also see in the PCVE practitioners context what we thought is worth sharing, right? So the presented case studies, and these were the same case studies in addition, and there were additional insights from other experts, seem to indicate that socioeconomic factors are not the determining factors, obviously. Noemie just raised that, right? Out of a group of people who face all kinds of factors and grievances, very few become radicalized. So while social welfare and putting money into infrastructure and housing and schooling is always a great idea, when we talk about what can PCVE practitioners do, we have to break it down a little bit. Because if not, we cannot work on the issue that I call the 1% problem, that out of every group of people with grievances and socioeconomic and other challenges, 99% don't radicalize, right? So this is, of course, not true in every context, but in most contexts, that it is a tiny minority within a tiny minority that decides to fight the system in general as an extremist and maybe even use violence. So we also found out that there is research, but not enough research yet, and that we also need more input from practitioners. But we have two factors that seem to be particularly relevant when they're present at the same time for the existence of hotbeds or hubs. First are these often charismatic entrepreneurs, leaders of extremism. Without leadership, there's rarely a hotbed, but you also need indifference or incompetence by local actors. This could be government, civil society, who miss out on the opportunity to intervene early on. And we have a couple of questions already that address that issue. How can we motivate governments to intervene early on? Usually politics reacts to something that has some sort of significance already. And this is the prevention challenge or paradox, I think, in general. Many other factors, grievances, ideology, psychological needs were discussed, but seem not to be sufficient. But if these two things come together, individuals that appear as leaders and indifference or incompetence by the environment, this is something that makes the likelihood of hotbeds and hubs increase dramatically. And often this can then become a tipping point and can be a tipping point function that could lead a sub-community. We also discussed the terminology and said sub-community is better than community because we don't want to label big groups of people, right? The issue of stigmatization is very important here. We also briefly looked into the online dimension and we identified a similar functionality. So if you have virtual entrepreneurs, people who are offering online content in an attractive way, and then you have indifferent or incompetence on side of the platforms that allow these entrepreneurs to work on, and also by the responsible government bodies due to a lack of regulation or lack of enforcement, you have the same functionality. So if these two things come together in the online sphere, you face similar problems. Now, recommendations that we developed, not everybody agreed with everything. That's always with a group of experts, but this was like what a lot of people thought is a good idea. Once the buildup of a hub has been verified, establish a local network comprised of pro-democratic associations, policymakers, experts early on to plan for effective actions and interventions. Early on is the key, are the key words here, I think. Aim at supporting pro-democratic pluralistic actors without framing the support necessarily as a PCVE intervention. This is something that Noemie has raised. We don't want to stigmatize, we don't want to complicate problems if that's not necessary. This also demands flexibility from funders, government funders, not to publicly label everything as security related. Focus on the actual geography, right? Sometimes it's just a street and not a neighborhood, or as Noemie said, sometimes it's just a house. So be very clear where exactly the hotbed is, not to stigmatize individuals or communities. Showcase initiatives and individuals that contribute to a more positive outlook on the neighborhood and therefore show the resilience of people living in the neighborhood, right? As again, most people in any neighborhood don't radicalize. What are their coping skills? What are their narratives? What is their empowerment that they use? Highlight those positive initiatives as role models. And when considering to publicly speak to extremists, make sure there's an in-depth understanding of the internal dynamics of the affected subcommunity. A public dialogue between extremists and policymakers could weaken the pro-democratic opposition and could strengthen the standing of extremists. So here we couldn't really agree, but this I think is a good compromise because it has happened in different cases that the speaking with extremists made them stronger. On the other hand, there's a good case to be made that at some point you have to speak to people, but be careful and make sure you know what you're doing. Once the extremist group is building up a hotbed, policymakers should establish a qualified task force from different institutions. So not just police, but also general local authorities, tax revenue collectors, building oversight. Build a task force that looks at the issue from different angles, taxation and donations, proper implementation of building or labor regulations could be things that help you limit the success of the hub early on. And the last thing, as soon as evidence is available that an extremist group is building a hotbed or recruits individuals for illegal activities, proceedings leading to a ban of this group should be considered. So this is our findings. We have this paper. I'm going to copy the link into the Q&A for everyone to access with a bit more background. And I'm stopping now with this part of the seminar.